The warm golden sunlight filtered through the towering glass walls of an exclusive boutique restaurant, nestled in the heart of an affluent neighborhood. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, their crystalline glow cascading down on the polished marble floors. The air was filled with a soft hum of classical music and the faint clinking of fine china as servers glided gracefully between tables. This was a world of elegance and privilege, a world where every detail whispered exclusivity. At the heart of this scene stood Margaret Hollingsworth, a middle-aged woman clad in an impeccably tailored designer suit. Margaret was the owner and self-proclaimed gatekeeper of the establishment, known as Elegance d'Or. Her silver jewelry glinted as she moved briskly through the dining area, her sharp eyes scanning every table. Margaret was proud of her reputation for serving only the right kind of clientele, those who fit her definition of sophistication and wealth. But as Margaret adjusted the placement of a crystal vase on a table, the soft chime of the entrance bell caught her attention. She turned sharply, her smile fading almost instantly as her gaze fell upon the man who had just stepped inside. Elijah Carter stood in the doorway, his tall, confident frame silhouetted against the sunlight streaming in behind him. Dressed in a simple yet clean button-up shirt and slacks, he exuded an air of calm dignity. His warm, welcoming smile was a stark contrast to the icy glare Margaret directed his way. For a brief moment, silence hung in the air. Margaret's well-trained staff froze, sensing the tension. To Margaret, Elijah was an unwelcome disruption, a figure who didn't belong in her meticulously curated world. She barely registered the warmth in his voice as he greeted her and inquired about a table for one. Instead, her mind raced with assumptions. "I'm sorry," Margaret said curtly, her voice clipped and cold. "We're fully booked for today." Elijah glanced around the half-empty restaurant, his brow furrowing slightly. "It seems like you have a few open tables," he replied, his tone polite but firm. Margaret's smile tightened. "Those are reserved," she snapped, folding her arms. Her words carried a tone of finality, as if daring him to challenge her. The other diners had begun to notice the interaction, their whispers and sideways glances filling the air. Elijah felt their eyes on him, but he remained composed. "I see," he said softly, his voice steady despite the sting of rejection. Margaret turned away, dismissing him with a wave of her hand. To her, the matter was closed. She prided herself on her ability to maintain control over her establishment, to ensure that it remained a sanctuary for the elite. But as Elijah took a step back, his calm demeanor never wavering, a young server hesitated nearby, clearly uncomfortable. "Excuse me," Elijah said, addressing the server instead. "I was hoping to try the special today. Is there truly no way to accommodate me?" The server glanced nervously at Margaret, who shot her a warning glare. "He's not a good fit for our clientele," Margaret interjected, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. This time, the murmur of the diners grew louder, a few eyebrows raised at Margaret's words. But no one spoke up. Margaret turned back to Elijah, her expression firm, as if daring him to push further. "I understand," Elijah replied calmly, his voice unwavering. "Thank you for your time." He turned to leave, his head held high, his steps measured and deliberate. But the tension he left behind lingered, heavy and unspoken. As the door closed behind him, Margaret allowed herself a small sigh of satisfaction. In her mind, she had upheld the integrity of her establishment. What she didn't realize, however, was that this seemingly trivial interaction would soon unravel her carefully constructed world. Margaret returned to her usual rounds, adjusting silverware and ensuring every table was perfect. But the exchange with Elijah lingered in her mind, not as guilt, but as irritation. The audacity, she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. To her, it wasn't personal. It was business. She had spent years cultivating Elegance d'Or into the epitome of exclusivity, and in her mind, Elijah simply didn't fit. Margaret's assumptions ran deep, rooted in years of privilege and an unexamined belief system. She didn't see Elijah as an individual, but as a stereotype. Her thoughts betrayed her biases. Someone like him wouldn't appreciate this place. He probably can't even afford the cheapest item on the menu. As she busied herself with arranging flowers, the young server, Emily, hesitated nearby. Emily had overheard the exchange, and her discomfort was evident. She approached Margaret cautiously. "Ma'am," Emily began softly, "about the gentleman who just left, he seemed polite and genuinely interested in dining here. Are we really fully booked?" Margaret straightened, her expression icy. "Emily," she said sharply, "we don't need to explain ourselves to every walk-in. This isn't a diner, it's a fine dining establishment. Not everyone belongs here." Emily's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but she didn't respond. She had grown up hearing about injustices like these, but had rarely seen them unfold so blatantly. Torn between her job and her conscience, she returned to her station, casting occasional glances toward the door, hoping Elijah hadn't gone far. Meanwhile, outside the restaurant, Elijah stood for a moment, collecting his thoughts. The sting of Margaret's words and actions weighed on him, but he refused to let anger take hold. He was no stranger to moments like this, moments where his dignity was tested by the prejudices of others. Elijah had worked hard to build his life. A successful entrepreneur and community advocate, he often found himself confronting subtle and not so subtle forms of discrimination. But today's experience felt different. The outright dismissal, the judgment in Margaret's eyes, and the implied message that he didn't belong struck a deeper chord. As he turned to leave, an older gentleman exiting the restaurant caught his eye. The man had overheard parts of the exchange and paused briefly. "Son," he said quietly, placing a hand on Elijah's shoulder, "I'm sorry you had to deal with that. Some people just don't know better." Elijah nodded, offering a small, appreciative smile. "Thank you, sir. It's not the first time, and it likely won't be the last. But that doesn't make it right." The man sighed, his face clouded with sadness. "No, it doesn't. I hope she realizes that one day." With that, he walked away, leaving Elijah with a renewed sense of determination. Inside the restaurant, the tension hadn't gone unnoticed by the diners. A middle-aged couple seated near the entrance whispered to each other, their disapproval evident. "Did you see how she treated him?" the woman murmured. "It's disgraceful." Her husband frowned, glancing toward Margaret, who was now chatting with a well-dressed patron as if nothing had happened. "We should say something," he said, but neither of them did. Like many others, they chose to remain silent, unsure of how to address the situation without causing a scene. Emily, however, couldn't shake her unease. She approached a fellow server, a young man named Daniel, and whispered, "Did you see what happened earlier?" Daniel nodded, his expression grim. "Yeah, it's not the first time she's done something like that. You know how she is, always judging people by their appearance." Emily bit her lip. "It's just wrong. And no one says anything. What can we do?" Daniel replied, shrugging. "It's her restaurant. If we speak up, we risk losing our jobs." Emily fell silent, her heart heavy. She wanted to stand up for what was right, but the fear of retaliation held her back. Margaret's behavior, while extreme, wasn't unique. It was a reflection of broader societal attitudes, subtle and overt biases that marginalized individuals face daily. From being followed in stores to being denied opportunities based on assumptions, people like Elijah encountered these challenges at every turn. For Margaret, her actions weren't malicious in her mind. She saw herself as a protector of her establishment's standards, but those standards were steeped in prejudice, perpetuated by a system that allowed people like her to wield power without accountability. Elijah's experience wasn't just about being turned away from a restaurant. It was a microcosm of the systemic inequality that persisted in countless forms. His calm response was a testament to his resilience, but it also highlighted a painful reality. The burden of confronting discrimination often fell on those who experienced it. As the day wore on, the incident began to ripple outward. Some of the diners shared their discomfort with friends and family, while Emily quietly debated whether to reach out to Elijah to apologize on behalf of the staff. Meanwhile, Margaret remained blissfully unaware of the growing unease her actions had sparked. What Margaret didn't realize was that this single moment of prejudice would soon set off a chain of events that would challenge her worldview and force her to confront the harsh truths she had long ignored. As the evening settled into its usual rhythm, Margaret believed the incident was behind her. The restaurant was bustling, and she thrived in the attention of her elite clientele. But the echoes of Elijah's calm yet pointed words, "It's not about your standards, it's about your assumptions," lingered in her subconscious, a subtle yet persistent discomfort she couldn't fully ignore. Unbeknownst to Margaret, Elijah hadn't left the situation entirely untouched. He had taken a seat at a nearby cafe, responding to an email from a colleague. He described the incident to her in brief, and her immediate response was, "You need to speak up." Elijah smiled to himself, considering his next steps. It wasn't revenge he sought, but change. He opened his phone and drafted a post on social media, recounting his experience in a tone that was firm yet dignified. "Today, I was reminded that prejudice isn't always loud or violent. It's often subtle, masked as standards or policy. I walked into a restaurant with the intent of enjoying a meal and was turned away without a second glance. Moments like these don't anger me. They challenge me to ask, how can we do better as a society?" He ended the post with a question for his audience. Have you ever experienced this kind of quiet exclusion? Let's start a conversation. Within minutes, the post began to gain traction. Comments poured in, some offering support and others sharing similar experiences. The story caught the attention of a journalist who recognized Elijah's name. Margaret was in the middle of a conversation with a regular patron when Emily approached her cautiously. "Ma'am," she said, her voice hesitant, "there's something you should see." Margaret frowned, annoyed at the interruption. "What is it, Emily?" Emily held out her phone, displaying Elijah's post, which now had hundreds of comments and shares. "It's about what happened earlier. People are talking about it online." Margaret's eyes narrowed as she read the post. At first, she dismissed it. "This is ridiculous," she scoffed. "People post anything these days." But as she scrolled through the comments, her confidence began to waver. Several users had identified her restaurant based on the description, and the responses were overwhelmingly critical. One comment read, "If this is true, it's shameful. No one should be treated this way, no matter what they look like or where they come from." Another added, "This isn't just one person's experience. It's part of a much larger problem. Businesses need to do better." Emily watched Margaret's reaction carefully. "People are upset," she said quietly. "I think this might get bigger." Margaret set the phone down with a huff, brushing off Emily's concern. "Let them talk. It'll blow over." But a seed of doubt had been planted. The next day, Elijah received an unexpected call. It was from the journalist who had seen his post. She introduced herself and asked if he'd be willing to share his story for an article she was writing about subtle forms of discrimination in high-end spaces. At first, Elijah hesitated. He wasn't sure if he wanted the attention, but the journalist's sincerity convinced him. "It's not just about what happened to you," she said. "It's about shedding light on something that happens to so many people who don't have a voice." They arranged to meet for an interview. During their conversation, Elijah spoke not only about the incident, but also about his work as an entrepreneur and advocate for equity in business. The journalist was impressed by his composure and insight. "You're not just a victim of this situation," she said. "You're a catalyst for change." The article, titled "When Standards Mask Prejudice: A Black Entrepreneur's Experience at an Upscale Restaurant," was published 2 days later. It quickly gained attention, sparking debates about discrimination and privilege in high-end establishments. At elegance.org, the fallout was immediate. Customers began canceling reservations, and negative reviews flooded the restaurant's social media pages. Margaret found herself under scrutiny, her reputation as a purveyor of excellence now tarnished. "What's happening?" Margaret demanded, scrolling through the reviews. One particularly scathing comment read, "Excellence isn't about exclusivity. It's about inclusivity. This restaurant clearly doesn't understand that." Daniel, the server, finally spoke up. "Ma'am, this is what happens when people feel disrespected. Maybe it's time to rethink how we treat customers." Margaret glared at him. "Are you suggesting I was wrong?" Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, what happened wasn't fair. And now people are holding us accountable." Margaret's initial reaction was anger. She felt betrayed by her staff and misunderstood by the public. But as the days passed and the backlash grew, she began to feel something else: shame. One evening, after the restaurant had closed, Margaret sat alone in her office, scrolling through the article about Elijah. For the first time, she read about his life, his achievements, his advocacy, and the quiet dignity with which he had approached the incident. Her mind wandered back to the look in his eyes when she turned him away. It wasn't anger or defiance, it was disappointment. And now she realized that disappointment was justified. Margaret sighed, leaning back in her chair. For years, she had prided herself on running an exclusive establishment. But in her pursuit of excellence, she had lost sight of what truly mattered: treating people with respect and fairness. She closed her eyes, grappling with the weight of her actions. The cracks in her facade were growing, and she couldn't ignore them any longer. Margaret sat in her office, the soft glow of her computer screen illuminating the articles and comments that now consumed her attention. The backlash was relentless. Yet, amidst the noise, one email caught her eye. The subject line read, "A chance to reflect." It was from Elijah. "Margaret, I've seen the impact of your actions, both on myself and on others who now question the values upheld in spaces like yours. While I was deeply hurt by what happened, I believe everyone is capable of change. This is not about tearing you down. It's about building a better understanding. I'd like to invite you to have a conversation. Not to accuse or blame, but to reflect and grow. It's up to you. Best, Elijah." Margaret hesitated. She had been avoiding direct confrontation, afraid of what it might reveal about herself. But something in Elijah's words struck a chord. This wasn't the attack she feared. It was an opportunity. She replied, "I'm willing to meet. Let me know when and where." A week later, they met in a quiet cafe. Margaret arrived early, nervous and unsure of what to expect. When Elijah entered, his presence was calm yet commanding. They exchanged pleasantries, and Elijah got straight to the point. "I want to start by saying that my goal isn't to humiliate you. It's to help you understand why what happened was so hurtful, not just to me, but to anyone who's ever faced discrimination." Margaret nodded, her hands folded tightly. "I've been thinking about it a lot. At first, I was defensive. I told myself I was just enforcing standards. But the more I've read and reflected, the more I realize how wrong I was." Elijah leaned forward. "It's not just about one interaction, Margaret. It's about what that interaction represents. People like me, people who don't fit into certain molds, are often judged before we even get a chance to prove who we are." Margaret's voice was soft when she replied, "I've been blind to it. I thought I was upholding excellence, but I see now that I was upholding prejudice." The conversation marked a turning point for Margaret. For the first time, she confronted the deep-seated biases that had shaped her actions. She decided to take public accountability. The next day, Margaret wrote an open letter, which she posted on the restaurant's website and social media pages. Asterisk, "To our valued patrons and community. I recently made a grave mistake. In an attempt to uphold what I believe to be the standards of my establishment, I turned away a guest based on my own prejudices. I am deeply sorry for the pain and harm I caused, both to the individual involved and to anyone who has ever faced discrimination. This experience has opened my eyes to the ways in which my actions, however unintentional, contribute to larger systemic issues. I am committed to learning, growing, and ensuring that Elegance becomes a place of inclusion and respect. To Elijah, thank you for your grace and willingness to help me see what I couldn't before. I hope this is the beginning of meaningful change, not just for me, but for everyone who walks through our doors." Asterisk. The post garnered mixed reactions. While some applauded her courage, others questioned her sincerity. But Margaret knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. Her actions would have to speak louder. Margaret took concrete steps to transform her business. She partnered with a diversity and inclusion consultant who conducted workshops for her staff on unconscious bias and equitable treatment. She also created a scholarship program for aspiring Black chefs and restaurateurs, aimed at breaking down barriers in the culinary industry. The first recipient of the scholarship, a young woman named Amara, spoke at the program's launch event. "I never thought someone like me could have a place in spaces like this," Amara said, her voice trembling with emotion. But this scholarship shows that change is possible and that people can learn from their mistakes. Elijah was in the audience that day, watching quietly. He saw in Margaret's actions a genuine effort to make amends. Margaret's transformation inspired others in her community to reflect on their own biases. A neighboring restaurant owner reached out to Elijah, asking for advice on creating a more inclusive environment. Elijah, in turn, used the experience as a catalyst for a larger initiative. He launched a campaign called Dine with Dignity, which aimed to promote equity and inclusion in the hospitality industry. For Margaret, the journey was far from over. She continued to grapple with guilt and the weight of her past actions. But she also felt a newfound sense of purpose. One evening, as she walked through the restaurant, she noticed Elijah sitting at a corner table. He had returned, not as a critic, but as a guest. Margaret approached cautiously. "Thank you for coming back," she said. Elijah smiled. "Thank you for giving me a reason to..." The transformation sparked by that one pivotal incident resonated far beyond the walls of Margaret's restaurant. It was no longer just about a single moment of prejudice. It became a catalyst for broader conversations, actions, and change. Months had passed, and Margaret had become a different person. No longer confined by the narrow worldview she once held, she actively sought to unlearn the biases that had shaped her past. She enrolled in workshops and seminars focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, where she met people from all walks of life. These interactions broadened her perspective and deepened her understanding of the systemic issues that perpetuate inequality. Margaret began using her platform as a business owner to advocate for equitable practices, not just in her restaurant, but across the local business community. Her restaurant, Elegance d'Or, underwent a symbolic and practical transformation. A sign now hung prominently at the entrance. "All are welcome here." The staff, once an echo chamber of exclusivity, became a diverse and inclusive team. Margaret personally interviewed and hired individuals from underrepresented backgrounds, ensuring her restaurant reflected the values she now embraced. But her journey wasn't without challenges. There were moments when Margaret felt the weight of skepticism from those who doubted her sincerity. Instead of retreating, she chose to face the criticism head-on, recognizing it as part of the accountability she needed to uphold. "I'll never be perfect," she admitted in a community panel discussion. "But I've learned that it's not about perfection. It's about progress and persistence. I owe it to Elijah, my staff, and everyone I wronged to keep striving for better." For Elijah, the incident was a testament to the power of dignity and grace. While the experience had been deeply hurtful, he refused to let it define him as a victim. Instead, he used it as a springboard to drive change. Through his Dine with Dignity initiative, Elijah worked tirelessly to create a network of restaurants committed to fostering inclusive environments. The campaign offered training, resources, and support to businesses looking to address implicit biases and promote equitable treatment. Elijah became a sought-after speaker, sharing his story at conferences, universities, and community events. He often recounted the moment in Margaret's restaurant, not as a tale of despair, but as an example of how change begins with difficult conversations. "I didn't change Margaret," he would say. "She chose to change herself." And that's the real power of owning up to our humanity. We can choose to be better for ourselves and for others. The incident and its aftermath sparked conversations across the community. Local businesses began re-evaluating their policies, seeking ways to create more inclusive spaces. Schools introduced anti-bias education into their curricula, inspired by Elijah's campaign. Margaret's restaurant became a symbol of redemption and growth. Former critics became regular patrons not because of the food alone, but because of the values the establishment now stood for. Amara, the scholarship recipient, also became a source of inspiration. Her journey from a struggling culinary student to a rising star in the industry was a testament to what could be achieved when barriers were dismantled. "I never imagined someone like Margaret would believe in someone like me," Amara said during a televised interview. "Her support changed my life." And now I want to pay it forward. The broader lesson was clear. Prejudice, while deeply rooted, could be confronted and overcome. The incident served as a stark reminder of the harm caused by unchecked biases, but also as a hopeful example of the growth that could follow accountability and action. Margaret's transformation demonstrated that change begins with acknowledgement. Elijah's response showed the strength of choosing grace over anger. Together, their story encouraged others to reflect on their own assumptions and commit to fostering a more equitable society. As the world grappled with ongoing issues of inequality, Margaret and Elijah's story became a beacon of hope. It reminded people that while no one could undo the past, everyone had the power to shape a better future. For the audience, the message was simple yet profound. Take a moment to reflect. Examine your own biases, no matter how subtle they may seem. Seek out opportunities to listen, learn, and grow. And when faced with injustice, have the courage to speak up, not to divide, but to unite in the pursuit of equity. One evening, as Margaret locked up her restaurant after another successful night, she paused to look at the sign on the door, "All are welcome here." It wasn't just a slogan. It was a commitment, a promise to herself, her community, and everyone who walked through her doors. And somewhere Elijah smiled, knowing that their story had sparked a change that would continue to ripple outward, inspiring countless others to choose empathy, understanding, and action. Let me know if you'd like further refinements or additional content.